Montana Rocky Mountain Front, January 1875. The temperature outside had dropped to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 33 degrees Celsius. By the time the sun disappeared behind the Continental Divide, wind moved across the Teton River Basin in long, low walls, not gusts, but sustained pressure, the kind that pushes through log gaps and under door frames like a blade finding a seam. That night, every cabin in the settlement of Cut Bank Crossing burned through wood at a rate that experienced frontiersmen considered normal, expected, unavoidable. Every cabin except one, at the far eastern edge of the settlement, pressed against a granite shelf that most homesteaders had considered useless building ground. A single structure held its interior temperature 11 degrees higher than the cabin directly to its north, and 20 degrees higher than two others across the creek. The difference was not a larger fire. It was not more wood. It was a wall. A strange, interior wall of stacked sandstone that one man had spent 3 weeks building while his neighbors watched and shook their heads. That man's name was Caleb Morrow. Scottish by blood, trapper by trade, and stubborn by reputation. He had arrived in the Teton Basin in the spring of 1872 with a pack mule, a splitting maul, and a set of ideas about heat that no one in the settlement had ever heard articulated out loud, because they came not from any book, but from 30 years of watching stone behave in cold weather. Tonight, as the wind drove snow horizontally across the valley floor, Caleb's fire had burned down to coals 2 hours ago. His cabin was still warm. If you ever wondered why some of the oldest frontier shelters in North America were warmer than modern insulated cabins burning 3 times the fuel, this story is for you. Like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We're uncovering the lost engineering of the frontier, and this is only the beginning. Caleb Morrow had not always lived in Montana. Before the Teton Basin, before the pack mule and the splitting maul, he had spent the better part of 2 decades trapping and guiding in the ranges of Western Canada and the Northern Idaho Territory. He was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had left Glasgow at 19 with a letter of introduction to a fur trading post and never looked back. But he was a precise observer, and what he had observed, year after year, was a pattern that the men around him seemed unable to see. Granite outcroppings near a campfire were still warm to the touch 6 hours after the fire went cold. Limestone shelves inside a cave held the temperature of the previous afternoon well into the night. A flat sandstone slab left in full sun from morning wood. Even in late October, release enough stored warmth against a canvas windbreak to make the difference between sleeping comfortably and not sleeping at all. Stone, Caleb understood, was not merely a building material. It was a battery. A slow, patient, honest battery that absorbed heat and returned it on its own schedule, long after the flame that charged it had gone out. The problem he faced in the winter of 1872, when he first broke ground at Cut Bank Crossing, was the same problem facing every settler in the northern Rockies. What was not infinite, and the cold was. The standard frontier cabin of the period, a single-room log structure, roughly 16 by 20 feet, with a stone fireplace built into one end wall, was a reasonable shelter in moderate cold. But in a Montana basin winter, where temperatures regularly fell below minus 15 Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius, for stretches of 10 days or more, a standard fireplace demanded continuous feeding. Oral account from the period suggests a typical frontier family in that region burned between 8 and 12 cords of wood in a single winter, a figure that required weeks of cutting and splitting in the warmer months, and still left many families borderline cold by February. Caleb had watched families shiver near roaring fires. He had watched men bank fires expertly and wake the frozen water pails 3 feet from the hearth. The fire was doing its job. The cabin was failing to hold what the fire produced. The heat was rising to the ceiling, escaping through the roof notches, and vanishing into the sky. The logs were absorbing almost nothing. The interior air cycled through cold pockets faster than any flame could replenish it. The solution, as Caleb saw it, was not more fire. It was more mass. Something behind that fire. Something that would drink the heat, hold it, and pay it back slowly, the way Stone had always done in every outcropping and cave face he had ever pressed his palm against. In the summer of 1874, he began collecting sandstone. The sandstone that Caleb selected came from a dry creek bed roughly a quarter-mile northeast of his cabin site. It was a buff-yellow sedimentary stone, dense and relatively fine-grained. the kind that splits cleanly along horizontal bedding planes and stacks with reasonable predictability. He was not choosing it at random. Sandstone, unlike granite, has a thermal conductivity profile that makes it slower to heat and slower to cool than most other common building stones. It absorbs radiant heat steadily and releases it gradually over many hours. Caleb did not use those words, but he knew the difference in his palms from decades of campfires. Over the course of 6 weeks in the late summer and early fall of 1874, he hauled stone to his cabin site using a hand sledge and the same pack mule that had carried him into Montana. Local oral accounts, preserved in a letter written by a neighboring homesteader named Ruth Aldrich to her sister in Ohio in the winter of 1875, describe Caleb making the trip to the creek bed more times than anyone bothered to count. When the stone was assembled beside the cabin, he had approximately 4,000 pounds of dressed sandstone slabs, most between 3 and 6 inches thick, stacked in rough courses. His plan was specific. Against the interior rear wall of his cabin, the wall directly opposite the fireplace, he intended to build a secondary mass wall, not a partition, not a decorative element, but a deliberate thermal absorber, a wall of stone standing approximately 18 inches from the existing log wall, rising from floor to ceiling height and extending across nearly the full width of the interior space. The gap between the log wall and the stone face would act as a narrow air channel. Warm air from the fireplace, rising and circulating through the cabin, would pass into that channel, heat the stone from behind, and be returned to the room. But the stone would continue releasing that absorbed heat for 6 to 8 hours after the fire was reduced or extinguished entirely. The total wall, once complete, measured roughly 14 feet across and 7 feet high, with an average thickness of 18 inches. Caleb mortared the joints with a mixture of clay, sand, and ash, a frontier technique that local builders of the period used regularly for chimney work, and which, when dried, produces a seal capable of withstanding significant thermal cycling without cracking. The finished structure weighed somewhere between 3,800 and 4,200 pounds, a mass calculation consistent with the dimensions and the density of the sandstone variety found in that drainage. He worked alone. His neighbors watched. Word spread quickly in a settlement the size of Cutbank Crossing. By the time Caleb had laid the third course of stone, 3 men had come by to inspect the project, and none of them approved. The most vocal critic was a builder named Orrin Flagg, who had constructed several of the cabins in the settlement using standard techniques imported from the Ohio Valley. Flagg was competent, experienced, and entirely confident. He stood at the door of Caleb's cabin, looked at the stone wall rising against the far logs, and said, according to Ruth Aldrich's account, that was the most wasteful use of a man's back he had ever witnessed. His technical objection was reasonable on its surface. Stone, Flagg argued, was cold. Everyone knew it. A stone floor in winter drew heat out of your boots. A stone wall in a mountain cabin would pull heat out of the room, not hold it in. Caleb was, in Flagg's estimation, building a refrigerator inside his own house. A second neighbor, a trapper named Silas Dunbar, added a structural concern. That much weight against a single log wall, he said, would shift the foundation in the spring thaw, torque the lower courses of the cabin, and cause the chinking to fail within 2 seasons. The mass was wrong for floor. The floor was not built for it. The whole idea was a risk to the structure for no gain that any sensible man could identify. The third visitor said nothing. He simply watched for a few minutes, then walked away. Sometimes silence carries more weight than argument. Caleb listened to all of it. He did not debate. He did not explain the thermal properties of sandstone because he had no scientific vocabulary for what he understood empirically. He said only that he had spent 30 years watching stone hold heat, and he intended to find out whether a wall would do the same thing inside a cabin. Then he went back to mixing his clay mortar. Flagg told at least 2 other settlers that the Scottish trapper had gone soft in the head from too many winters alone. By October 1874, Caleb Morrow's stone wall project had become the standing joke of Cutbank Crossing, a monument to stubbornness, the kind of thing that men mention when talking about the particular madness that the mountains could produce in a solitary man. The wall was finished by the first week of November. 3 weeks later, the temperature dropped to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 35 degrees Celsius, and it stayed there for 9 days. Before we get to what those 9 days revealed, Make sure you like this video and subscribed. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. The result of that blizzard changed how an entire valley thought about heat. And we're about to show you the numbers. The storm did not arrive with drama. It arrived the way the worst ones always do in a northern basin. Quietly from the northwest, with a sky that turned the color of old pewter by mid-afternoon, and then simply stayed that way. By the evening of November 28, 1874, the thermometer nailed to the post outside the Cutbank Crossing, trading post read minus 19 Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius. By midnight, it had dropped another 12 degrees. The wind that followed was not violent. It was patient and horizontal, the kind that finds every gap between log courses and every warped door frame in a settlement, and works them like a key in a lock. Inside the cabins of Cutbank Crossing, families did what they had always done. They stoked their fires. They pulled children and livestock closer to the hearth. They burned wood. Orrin Flagg, by his own later account, went through nearly 3/4 of core in the first 48 hours of the cold wave, a pace that, if sustained across 9 days, would have consumed more than 3 full cords from his winter reserve. His cabin, a well-built 16 by 18-foot structure with a standard end-wall fireplace and good chinking, held an interior temperature that fluctuated between 38 and 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 to 7 degrees Celsius, during the coldest overnight hours, even with a maintained fire. His family slept in layers, kept the children near the hearth, and managed. It was hard. It was the expected kind of hard. Silas Dunbar, whose structural concerns about Caleb's floor load had seemed so reasonable 2 months earlier, fared similarly. His cabin ran slightly warmer on the south-facing wall, closer to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, near the fire, but dropped sharply toward the rear, a common pattern in single-fireplace frontier structures where radiant heat dominated the near zone and convective circulation failed to carry warmth to the far corners. Caleb Morrow let his fire burn normally for the first 2 days. On the third day, the coldest of the 9, when the thermometer outside the trading post registered minus 31 Fahrenheit, minus 35 degrees Celsius, at dawn, he reduced the fire to a sustained but modest burn, not a roaring blaze, a working fire, the kind a man keeps when he is not worried. Ruth Aldrich, whose cabin sat 40 yards north of Caleb's, sent her oldest son to check on the Scottish trapper on the morning of that third day, partly out of neighborly concern and partly, she admitted in her letter, out of curiosity about the wall. The boy came back and reported that Caleb was eating breakfast at his table without a coat on. The fire, the boy said, was no bigger than you keep for cooking. If this story is making you rethink what you know about heat and shelter, hit that like button before we get to the numbers. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this series. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every single one. On the 5th day of the cold wave, with temperatures still locked below minus 20 Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius, Ruth Aldrich walked to Caleb's cabin herself. She brought a neighbor, a man named Hector Pruitt, who had lived through 3 Montana winters and considered himself a fair judge of a shelter's performance. Together they knocked, entered, and stood in the interior of the cabin with the thermometer Ruth had carried from her own home, a mercury instrument she had brought from Cincinnati, accurate to within 2 degrees Fahrenheit. The reading inside Caleb's cabin, taken 4 feet from the floor near the center of the room, with a fire that had been banked to coals approximately 90 minutes prior, was 67 degrees Fahrenheit, 19 degrees Celsius. Ruth Aldrich's cabin, measured the same morning with the same thermometer, 4 feet from the floor, with an active fire burning, 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius. The difference was 26 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius, with Caleb's fire not even burning. Later that same day, Hector Pruitt measured Orrin Flagg's cabin under active fire conditions, 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius, at center room height. The gap between Flagg's active fire and Caleb's bank coals was 23 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius. Average across the 3 comparison points recorded in Ruth Aldrich's letter, Caleb's cabin ran approximately 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius, warmer than equivalent structures under equivalent or worse fire conditions. The stone wall had been absorbing heat for 3 days. It had been drinking in the output of that modest working fire and holding it in its 4,000 pounds of buff sandstone mass, releasing it back into the room slowly, steadily, at a rate governed by the thermal properties of the stone rather than the rhythm of feeding a fire. The physics were not mysterious. Dense sandstone, at that mass and thickness, has a heat retention window of roughly 6 to 10 hours under the temperature differential present in that cabin. When Caleb reduced his fire to coals, the wall continued to radiate. The room continued to hold, with consumption told the same story from a different angle. Over the 9-day cold wave, Caleb burned an estimated 1¼ cords of wood. Orenflag, by his own tally, burned closer to 2¾ cords across the same period, in a cabin of nearly identical floor area. The mass wall had not eliminated the need for fire. It had changed the relationship between fire and warmth, stretching each burning hour into 6 or 8 hours of continued heat return, reducing the total fuel demand by something in a range of 40 to 55% compared to the standard fireplace structures in the settlement. Hector Pruitt stood in the center of Caleb's cabin for a long moment after taking the temperature reading. Then he looked at the stone wall, 14 feet of stacked sandstone, still faintly warm to the touch on his face, and said nothing. Sometimes the numbers do not need a commentary. Orenflag did not apologize. That was not the frontier way, and no one expected it. But in the spring of 1875, when the snow pulled back from the Teton Basin and the ground softened enough to work, Flagg was seen hauling sandstone from the same creek bed Caleb had used the previous summer. He did not ask Caleb for instructions. He did not need to. He had seen the wall, taken the temperature, done the arithmetic. By midsummer, a mass wall of his own was rising against the interior rear face of his cabin. It was slightly thinner than Caleb's, roughly 14 inches rather than 18, and it used a different mortar mix, heavier on sand than clay. But the intent was identical. The stone would hold the heat. Hector Pruitt followed within the same season. His wall was built into a new addition he was framing onto his existing cabin, which gave him the advantage of designing the air channel from the start rather than retrofitting it. He extended the gap between the stone face and the log wall to a full 22 inches, wider than Caleb's 18, creating a more generous convective channel that local oral accounts suggest performed comparably well, though no direct temperature measurements from Pruitt's cabin survive. By the winter of 1876, at least 6 structures in and around Cutbank Crossing incorporated some version of an interior thermal mass wall. 2 of them were built by men who had never spoken directly to Caleb Morrow. They had simply watched Flagg's construction and drawn their own conclusions. A 7th structure, a small community shelter built near the trading post in the fall of 1876 to house travelers caught between settlements in bad weather, was built with a double-sided mass wall, stone accessible from both interior faces, a refinement that no single builder in the settlement could claim credit for. It had evolved from conversation, from observation, from the particular intelligence that frontier communities developed when individual failure carried real consequences. Caleb himself made one modification to his original wall in the spring of 1876. He added a shallow ash shelf at the base of the stone face, a recessed ledge where he could place a cast iron pan with ash during overnight cold, allowing the residual heat of the ash to contribute a secondary radiant layer at floor level, where cold air naturally pooled. It was a small refinement. It cost nothing but a few hours of careful stonework. Oral accounts preserved in a later Homesteader journal suggest it added a measurable degree of warmth to the lower third of the room, the zone where children slept and where cold always settled first. The Scottish trapper never charged anyone for the idea. He never wrote it down. He simply built it, let the winter prove it, and went back to his trapping. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not travel well through formal channels. It does not survive in textbooks because it was never written there. It does not appear in building codes because the men who developed it were dead before building codes existed. It lives, when it lives at all, in the dimensions of old walls, in the thickness of a stone course that seems unnecessary to a modern eye, in the place in a fireplace that appears slightly off-center until you understand what it was aligned to, in the gap between a stone face and a log wall that a 20th century renovator might have filled in without a second thought. Caleb Morrow was not an inventor. He was an observer who took what stone had been telling him for 30 years and gave it a permanent form. The physics behind his wall, thermal mass, radiant re-emission, convective circulation through a narrow air channel, are not frontier secrets. They are measurable, reproducible, and as valid today as they were in the Montana Basin in November of 1874. A 4,000-pound sandstone wall does not care what century it is operating in. It absorbs heat at the same rate. It releases it on the same schedule. The only thing that changes is whether anyone is patient enough to let it do its work. The lesson of cut bank crossing is not that modern construction is wrong. Insulation, vapor barriers, and efficient combustion systems have saved more lives than any thermal mass wall ever could at scale. The lesson is narrower and more specific, that the men and women who built in extreme cold, without those systems, were not guessing. They were engineering. They were using materials they could read with their hands, in geometries they had tested with their lives, to solve problems that modern comfort has made easy to forget were ever problems at all. Caleb Morrow's cabin was still standing, according to a survey of the Teton Basin settlement conducted in 1901, 26 years after the blizzard that proved his wall correct. The stone interior face had settled slightly at the base, an inch and a half of drift over a quarter century of thermal cycling. But the mortar had held. The chinking in the surrounding log walls had been replaced twice. The stone had not needed touching. Some materials, when chosen with patience and placed with understanding, simply last. If this story changed the way you think about heat, mass, and the engineering intelligence of the American frontier, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Every week we go deeper into the lost building knowledge of the men and women who survived without the systems we take for granted. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and let us know what technique you want us to cover next. The frontier has more secrets than one wall, and we're just getting started. Educational and historical reconstruction, names, measurements, and dialogue are very similar composites based on documented frontier building practices of the northern Rocky Mountain region, circa 1870 to 1880, oral account references, Ruth Aldrich letter, Hector Pruitt observations, are narrative devices consistent with the period's communication patterns. This content does not substitute for professional engineering or construction guidance.